Hello everyone and welcome to the Why webinar for September, which is part of what the Wellbeing, Health and Youth NHMRC Centre of Research Excellence does each month to look at new research in the area of adolescent health. I do remind everyone that we have a number of collaborations across Australia, and I acknowledge all the partners who are part of the CRE. I also would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. And we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. We also invite everyone to be part of our Why community of practice. It's a community of research practice, but I think we look at it more as a community of practice where we translate research into real life. And just watch our website because there'll be more information coming up soon. And just a few housekeeping rules. While the webinar is going, your microphone will be muted and video switched off. If you have something to say or if you want to ask the presenter a question, then please use the chat panel, which is at the top of your screen. And questions will generally be answered at the end of the webinar. And please, of course, type any comments in that you would like to make. So it is my great pleasure today to introduce Professor Corinne, who is a Professor of Digital Health and co-chair of the Nanosensors and Diagnostic Cluster within the University of Sydney's Nano Health Initiative. Corinne also co-chairs the Children and Adolescents Health and Wellbeing in the Pacific node for the Charles Perkins Centre. Her team co-designs evidence-based digital health interventions to promote more active lifestyles among young people in Australia and across the Pacific. And it is a delight to have you with us here, Corinne. So over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Kate, for this introduction. I have to say I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to present today as part of the WISE webinar series. Before we get started, I just wanted to acknowledge the traditional custodians of Australia and would like to share that today I'm sitting and speaking from Gadigal land, and I pay my respect to leaders past, present and emerging. So today the presentation is really about using wearables, sensors, and I'm going to particularly focus on activity trackers in a way to better understand physical activity in young people, children and adolescents, and to really try to understand how we could leverage digital health technologies and sensors to better understand physical activity patterns. So I'm going to talk about physical activity guidelines, just to give a little bit of a context to why we are interested in physical activity in the young population, physical activity in adolescents, and the World Health Organization ambitions for young people worldwide in terms of physical activity. Then I'm going to switch on to talking about wearables and how they can be used or how they are used to evaluate physical activity in people, methods to identify patterns and changes in response to interventions. And then I will finish by presenting one digital health promotion program that we have designed with colleagues from the University of Sydney and the University of New Caledonia, and how we've been able to take advantage of the wearables to support learning and to as well assess exactly what's happening when such an intervention is developed. And then I said a few words about what's next for us. So what about the World Health Organization guidelines on physical activity for children? Some of you may already be aware of that, but on these guidelines released in 2020, you can see that the recommendation in terms of physical activity for young people are to perform at least 60 minutes a day on average across the week of moderate to vigorous physical activity. So I just wanted straight away to focus your attention on the fact that in the guidelines, they're not talking just about physical activity, but pointing to the fact that the quality of this physical activity is at the intensity level of moderate to vigorous. On the top of that, on the right side of the slide, you can see that what is recommended is at least 3 days a week of vigorous intensity. So really trying to get on the higher scale of the aerobic intensity activities, and as well to think about strengthening and activities. So based on these guidelines, we can imagine that then what's going to be important when we try to assess physical activity and movement in young people is to be able to identify that moderate to vigorous physical activity. So I'm going to say a few words about how MVPA is assessed and how wearable sensors can potentially add some intel into that. So in most of the past studies in the world, physical activity and MVPA have been assessed using surveys, validated questionnaires, and usually those questionnaires have been developed in high-income countries and disseminated worldwide. So for example, for us, when we came to do some studies in the Pacific region, we realized that at some point those surveys were not really fit for purpose in those populations. In the recent years, if we go back to 10 years ago, research has started to use more and more wearables, particularly wrist activity trackers, to identify when people were active and in particular when they were engaged in moderate to vigorous physical activity. So why are we focusing on this moderate to vigorous physical activity? Well, this is because the research evidence has shown that when young people were doing those 60 minutes a day on average of moderate to vigorous physical activity, there was an impact on physical fitness. And I really would like to point to you that physical fitness is an important aspect, because this is through a good physical fitness that a lot of cardiometabolic health and mental health and the reduction of adiposity you can see on this slide are driven. So physical activity is important, MVPA is a focus, and raising the physical fitness is another very important focus. And the ambition for the World Health Organization globally is to reach by 2030 an increase in physical activity, which they expressed as reducing physical inactivity by 15% in 2030. So if we look at the status worldwide of physical activity, we can see there's a little bit of work, I guess, to do to continuing promoting and trying to increase physical activity in young people. So on this large study published in The Lancet in 2019, almost 300 school-based surveys were studied from 146 countries, which was 1.6 million students aged between 11 and 17 years. And what the study showed was that 81% worldwide of students were not sufficiently active. So which leaves us with roughly 20% of young people worldwide being sufficiently active. And you can notice on the slide on the top, you have the repartition for the boys and at the bottom for the girls. And when it's green, it means that the physical activity is met. When it goes to yellow and orange, it means there's more students not meeting the physical activity guidelines. All right, so now let's get into the wearable technologies and trying to understand what's the landscape and what I'm going to talk about today. So on that slide, you can see there's a little bit of a bias. I'm sorry, I couldn't find something better because we can see a very fit man. I was trying to find a woman, but that was a little bit more complicated. Anyway, we have this picture where I think what is interesting is we have a representation of the different senses existing at the moment and why the type of data they can provide. So you can see they can provide a number of different data from the cardiometabolic side of things, from the oxygenation of the blood, the respiratory system, the muscle system, some kind of indication about stress, physical activity, and sleep. And what I'm going to talk about today mostly are the data collected via activity trackers. I'm going to talk essentially about trackers worn on the wrist, and I'm going to talk about how the data have been used so far and what we've developed in the team. I just wanted to point that there's still a lot of work that can be done to better understand how sensor fusion could be potentially be done in a better way to provide information for the young population in terms of their behaviors. So we did a little bit of scoping review to try to understand what type of activity trackers were used across different research, and we particularly focused on those research in which people have tried to develop algorithms to either better understand patterns or to try to classify the activities. So being just conscious that there's a wider range of studies that have used activity trackers, but here I'm talking about those studies who have tried to go a little bit further than just collecting how many steps a day were performed or how many minutes of moderate to vigorous activities. But basically, you can see that the type of technology that has been used is across, there's two main categories. One category are called the research grade sensors. And within those ones means the sensors have been validated against, laboratory studies. They provide accurate data, and usually they provide as well quite a lot of data because they are able to register quite a lot of data point per second. The two main sensors that have been used are the actigraph and the GeneActive. Years ago, those sensors were just uniaxial accelerometry, so providing accelerometry only in one direction. But now we have access to triaxial accelerometry, which means that it's a bit more complicated. It provides acceleration in different directions, but then it provides opportunities to do a little bit more with the data. In those studies as well, commercial trackers have been used, and we've used some of them as well in some of our studies. Those ones usually are not validated. Now I have to say there's more and more validation study with the Fitbit. And one characteristic as well is that it's usually extremely difficult to access the raw data. And because for commercial, I guess, reason, the raw data are not that easily disseminated. Again, with the Fitbit, there's now more possibilities to do that. Amongst the studies as well, some studies have combined accelerometry and heart rate. And I guess the advantage of that is that it provides information on movement, but the heart rate as well is a very good indicator and potentially more precise indicator of the intensity of the exercise or the movement that's been produced by the person. So it provides more precise information on intensity. So, okay, a point I wanted to really make, and this is how, this is about the data we potentially have access when we work with research grade activity trackers, for example, and the type of data we are using. And basically, in lots of studies, the acquisition sampling is quite high, so the sample rate can go between 30 Hz to 100 Hz. So it means that in some studies, people have 100 data points per second for many days, which is huge. The autonomy varies between 1 day and 1 year, so this is as well something that can be taken into consideration. And here you can see that usually the studies again, those studies looking at developing some algorithm to understand a little bit better what's happening, have a duration that can go from 4 days to 1 year. So there's a huge number of data that are collected. On that table on the left, you can also see that amongst all of those studies, only a small number were performed in young people and adolescents. What I wanted to point as well is, despite the fact that there is access to that high level of data, most of the time data are aggregated and returned in terms of research outcome either over the day. So you can see a number of different studies would report physical activity levels in terms of steps or in terms of time spent in an MVPA during a day on average. Some use the month, the week. A few of them report data per minute, but there's very few studies that have really taken all of the advantage of the granularity of those data that are collected to, I guess, beyond just expressing how many minutes are spent at a given intensity, really to try to understand the physical activity patterns. So how often, for how long, and in which pattern young people engage in those activities. Before we go a little bit further into analyzing the data, I just wanted to describe how we bridge the data coming from the census to the World Health Organization guidelines. So the data coming out of the census are accelerometry data, and the recommendations, for example, if we wanted to have a sense of at which level of intensity the person is performing the activities, are given in terms of moderate to physical activity, which is referring most of the time at an intensity related to the aerobic capacity and the aerobic capacity. So how do we link data that are, or indication that are provided in different values, I would say. So it goes through a number of different validation studies that have in the lab asked people to do a number of different types of physical activity while they were recording oxygen uptake. And oxygen uptake is going to give an indication on the metabolic equivalent, so the energy expenditure of the person. And the energy expenditure of the person is going to be related to the intensity of the exercise. So for example, 1 MET is when someone spends, basically this is the resting condition, 3.5 mils per kilo and per minute of oxygen. And the threshold that have been set up for young people are that if we want to consider moderate to vigorous physical activity, it would have to set at a value of 3 to 4 METs. It could depend between the different publications. So in those studies, people were wearing activity trackers, while at the same time, oxygen uptake was measured, which was a way to link the oxygen uptake and the metabolic equivalent, and then infer on the exercise intensity. So you can see on the graph on the left side that we have risk accelerometry data and METs on the vertical axis. The blue points are the data collected during the lab, during lab experiments, and the red points are data collected in free living conditions. And everything that's shaded in blue would be moderate to vigorous physical activity. So basically, acceleration data are matched to METs through what is called cutoff values. So we would say, for example, when the accelerometry is about 200 mgs, then it means that the person is actually performing an activity that is around 3 METs. So we can classify that activity as moderate activity. So this is how the data, the accelerometry data coming out of the sensors are connected to energy expenditure. But what I wanted to point, because a number of studies have published different thresholds in terms of accelerometry corresponding to energy expenditure. And I just wanted to point that when we do a study, we need to try to understand a little bit the context and have a look at the literature and use the right sensor with threshold that have been developed for that sensor with the same population. And even when we do that, we can realize here, for example, that we have different studies. And if we use different cutoff values or thresholds in terms of accelerometry to determine the time spent in moderate to vigorous activity, you can see that depending on the studies and the different cutoff for the same data set, the time spent in MVPA could be quite different. And it's, you know, the difference can be quite wide. So it's very important to really understand the context, really understand the population, and how actually the data from the accelerometry are derived to calculate or assess the time spent in moderate to vigorous activity. So I've just talked about the threshold, but another point that is very important are what we call bouts, which is, you know, we have data, we have 100 points or 60 data points per second, then we could average the data per second, and then what do we do with that? Are we trying to pick up every second that is MVPA, or are we trying to potentially aggregate the data or try to identify bouts of physical activity that we're going to focus on? And what I wanted to show on that slide is that I guess we can make any kind of decision. We just need to understand the consequences of making decisions. So for example, on that slide, these are data collected in primary school children, and we have the hours between 7 a.m. and 9 a.m. in the morning. On the first two figures at the top show data when only 1 second bouts are used. So each second is tagged with the intensity being light, and this is everything that's in green. Moderate, this is everything that's in blue or vigorous. On the left side, we have male participants, and on the right side, we have female participants. And the two figures at the bottom represent exactly the same participants, except that in that situation, what's been done is that data have been averaged over 1 minute, and then each bout of 60 seconds has been tagged with either light, moderate, or vigorous intensity. So what do we see? Well, first we can see that when only we work with 1 second bouts, there's lots of blue, which means lots of 1 second that are performed at moderate activity. So maybe part of that is, you know, potentially agitation and not physical activity. But we can see there's quite a lot, and we can see that potentially the boys in that study were quite active, you know, just before entering the class. So in that space between 8:30 and 9 a.m., there's quite a lot of activity. We can see it's quite different when we go on the right side and we have a look at the data coming from the female, and it looks like there's minimal physical activity. But still we can detect a little bit of physical activity. If we go to the 60-second bouts, we can see that then there's a lot of physical activity that's disappearing compared to the graph at the top, but we still retain a number of physical activity in the boys. But you can see that if we go on the right side and we have a look at the female, most of the physical activity completely disappear. So it's not neutral to decide that we're going to look at the data average over 1 second or 15 seconds or 60 seconds. I think what we can see in that slide is that when people are less active, I would say they are disadvantaged by using longer duration for the bouts. So that would be the case here for the female. So we could potentially ask if physical activity assessed by trackers has been consistently underestimated in female? This is a question that I think remains open. We can see as well that if we go to the vigorous, which is in red, again, it disappears when we go to the 60-second bouts most of the time. So it's not neutral, and we need to find a good way to average the data in young people. And it's particularly true because physical activity patterns in young people are completely different from the physical activity patterns in older people. I think you would never see spontaneously a 7-year-old child or a 12-year-old child just go on a jog for an hour. Like, I think it doesn't exist. What they do are bursts of physical activity, moderate to vigorous, but in a very short period of time, very short bouts. So the risk is that if we average over a longer period of time, we're going to miss a lot of that physical activity. What I wanted to show on that slide as well, what we have are different participants, male and female. The dark column show the minutes spent in MVPA, so we can see that there's quite a lot of variability within boys and girls. We can see there's more physical activity in MVPA, or more time in MVPA in the boys. But what the pink bars show is the average percentage of the maximal aerobic capacity. So I wanted to show that because even when, if we take the participant number 3, for example, doing quite a lot of, spending quite a lot of time in MVPA, we can see that on average, the exercise is around 40% to 50% of VO2 max. So this is something we need to explore a little bit more further in young people, is when we talk about MVPA, where in that MVPA do they do the physical activity? And in our studies, we realized it's mostly within the moderate range. So they spend a very small period of time in the vigorous area. Okay, so this being said, what I wanted now to show you is what we've done with the data we collected and our approach to try to identify short bouts of moderate to vigorous activity in that population. So the data I'm going to show you when I talk about research grade activity trackers are coming from the GeneActive, and this is a triaxial, so we have data acceleration for the 3 different directions, and we try to extract from that activity vectors. Now, the approach we've taken is to tag each second using existing threshold with either light, moderate, or vigorous activity, but not to aggregate the data, but instead to try to identify each bout of 3 seconds. And we've chosen 3 seconds because we did some studies and we demonstrated that shorter than that, we capture too much noise, but longer than that, we miss out on some of the relevant activity bouts. So we try to identify all of the bouts tagged with moderate and vigorous lasting at least 3 seconds. Now, what we've done in our approach as well is we asked the question, which is, what if instead of just trying to identify moderate to vigorous activity, we also try to identify sedentary time? There's no specific guidelines about sedentary time yet, but we know that the time spent in being sedentary is a time that may need to be reduced and to be kind of trade-off with physical activity and MVPA. So we analyzed all of the data we had collected on a larger group of students aged 12 years old, and we had a look at the daily activities. So what was happening during the day here, and we've tried to identify those physical activity MVPA tags that were lasting at least 3 seconds, But for the sedentary time, we thought, well, wait, maybe being sedentary for 3 seconds doesn't really mean anything. So we tagged any bout that was identified as sedentary that was lasting at least 2 minutes. And we would say, well, in that situation, then we have people who are actually being sitting or not doing physical activity, not moving at all for 2 minutes. And we consider that sedentary time. So here what you can see is when we analyzed the data, we clusterized the different days of the cohort using both the sedentary time and the time spent in MVPA. And we identified that we could meaningfully analyze the data if we had 6 clusters. So you can see here the 6 cluster on that slide. And we were able as well to describe what was happening in those clusters. So for example, if we take the first one, there is quite a lot of sedentary time and not a lot of active time. So this is all of the days clustered in that cluster are days with minimal MVPA and quite a lot of sedentary time. When we move towards the higher end of the spectrum, here we can see that from the cluster number 4, the days provide at least the 60 minutes of MVPA, just as is recommended. And then when we go up to 5 and 6, then we have more physical activity and we have less sedentary time. So this is really the cluster in which we would like the kids to move because there's less sedentary time and more MVPA. Okay, so in the next part of this talk, I wanted to present how we have started to integrate the different algorithms we have used to develop a digital platform, which is a health education platform that is aiming to improve physical activity and particularly focusing on moderate to vigorous physical activity and really try to engage young people into doing more physical activity. So we have used in the platform commercial trackers that will provide step data on every day of the program, and we use the data from the trackers to support learning activities so the young people understand what it means to actually perform moderate to vigorous physical activity. So we've used all of the data during the program to help the children to understand what it was to do that activity. We also mapped all of the different modules and the content of the learning with the Australian framework for physical literacy. And we have included as well in the program behavior change techniques. So what I wanted to present as well is, so we've developed this platform, iEngage, which has the 10 modules containing health education supported by activity trackers. And we developed the program for 2 different contexts. So we developed for the Australian context, but we also developed that platform to be implemented in the Pacific region. And in that case, that was in New Caledonia, in the small island of Lifu. And I wanted to demonstrate that technology can be used in remote locations and that technology can be used in those locations, providing an amazing opportunity to actually assess implementation of the intervention, because all of the data collected in the platform can be used to understand the outcome and the physical activity patterns. So we developed that, we implemented the iEngage program in the small community of Wei in Lifu. I just wanted to show you here how it looks like. So there is the area in which we have the school on the right side, and you can see that the housing is quite dispersed along different streets. There's facilitated access to the beach, so they have a number of possibilities to go swimming and do some aquatic activities. And there's a stadium as well that is quite accessible. So the context is kind of in favor of physical activity. In terms of the cohort of children involved, that was a small cohort. We had 35 kids involved, but the way their days were made, here we have some indication about sleep and the time using screens. I'm not going to spend too much time because we were not directly addressing those data, but overall the kids really had not enough sleep every day. Around 35% of them do at least 60 minutes of moderate to physical activity, and 50% have good physical fitness, but we still have 38% of those children and adolescents living with overweight and obesity. We thought it was a great opportunity to deliver a digital health education program in that context, because the school context was quite in favor of physical activity, with quite a lot of space in the school that the children could use for formal and informal physical activity, a good communication with teachers and community leaders with which we have engaged, and the students as well, where in the previous years we had as well engaged to try to understand their physical activity. The school and the community is well deserved, deserved with internet connection. So we didn't, I mean, reasonably accessed well the internet connection. Here, just a little bit of description into the program. So the program was made of 10 modules that were designed into an app. Each module lasted 60 minutes. They were self-directed, so each kid could access the module and do all of the different activity at their own pace. There was a little bit of reading. You can see the different activities included quizzes about the learning and the knowledge they had about physical activity. Some assessing knowledge. They had goal setting activities, goal achievement activities as well, once they have data into the platform to try to understand if they had achieved their goals. Lots of peer learning activity within the classroom. Maybe I didn't mention, I mean, it was in a school setting, so the platform was delivered in classes, so the whole class would do the program at the same time. We had a little bit of physical activity session, but it was very small. It was never more than 5 minutes during the module, because it was really experiential learning for the kids, using the data from the sensor to understand the different levels of physical activity and what it means to be physically active. And on the right side, we had the platform mapped with the different domain related to the Australian physical literacy. Physical domain, psychological, social, and cognitive. The design was, we believe, quite inclusive. We didn't want to kind of identify any profile or any kids in any way. So we took the option to use mascots and animals to drive the kids and to help the kids to engage with the different activities. It was an inclusive program because each kid had a kit with a tablet, a booklet. So it was a mix of getting the intervention from the tablet, but being able as well to take notes and take the notes home so they could connect with the parents and the community. And the activity tracker, which was quite small, and they had to keep this one for the 10 modules, which means over the 5 weeks of the program. And so this is how the information was communicated and how the data was communicated to the kids in the platform. Just wanted to share a few pictures. I really want to make the point that it's completely possible, and it's absolutely amazing to work with and to bring technology in communities, in remote communities, even if sometimes there's issues in terms of finding the right room to set up all of the activity sensors, having to work late at night, not, sometimes having the shop for repair. You can see Réparation Vente, which is where you repair any technology, open at all times. But you have the people really around you helping. And we had in this program, when we did it in New Caledonia, leaders. We had videos within the program of community leaders communicating very important health messages to the children in local language, so in the Geo language. And it was absolutely amazing how it empowered the children to engage with the program. So really this mix between something that's the technology coming from us, but as well the community and the local culture and the local language engaging as well in the program. Here as well to demonstrate, we had videos demonstrating some activities, and again these were local leaders that were involved in that, and all of the kids really engaged in different ways with the platform, engaging with the different activities. So what is the kind of data we get? And I really wanted to share that because it's about delivering the program, but it's about as well the type of data we collect within the platform that really help us understand how the participants responded to the different modules. And what you can see on the slide, so on the left slide, it's about the goals the children set for themselves. And we can see in the blue line that progressively they set goals of increasing challenge, and the goals were in steps. So at some point they all kind of, 85% of the kids would just choose to try to achieve their 11,000 steps a day. And the bars, the colorful bars at the bottom going from blue to green, show how progressively the cohorts kind of moved from lower steps in terms daily steps to higher daily steps. On the right side, we have not only the goals on the dotted line, but we have as well the achievements. And we can see that progressively the kids kind of increase the number of steps they were doing. The graph at the bottom with the green and the yellow bars shows the percentage of days on which the kids were meeting the goals. Okay, so at the beginning, the goals were easier, so most of them would meet the goals, but we can see that in the middle, when it becomes a little bit more challenging, a smaller proportion of the kids would meet the goals. And again, they kind of, toward the end, get to achieving the goals. So in this paper published with my colleagues really involved in this work, Olivier Galli from the University of New Caledonia and Kalina Yassef from computer science at the University of Sydney, what we have here are, through this activity tracker providing steps during the program, we have on a daily basis how the consistency of the days above 11 steps. So the percentage of days across the program performed, in which the kids perform more than 11,000 steps. What we can see is there are changes. Okay, so we can see that if we compare the beginning to the end, there is an increase in terms of the percentage of days showing 11,000 steps. But we can see as well it's quite variable. And we need to understand what is it that potentially trigger the kids to do more, but what is it potentially as well within the programs that at some point made the response not what we would expect here. So the only thing we could kind of find is there had quite a lot of rain at that time, which could be preventing physical activity. But there was as well at the end, and still they were increasing the physical activity. We can see as well the dotted line are the kids that were at the beginning the less active. So they are exactly, on the same kind of pattern, and they benefit as well from the program. On that slide, what we want to show on that slide are, again, using the days during the program recorded by the activity tracker. We used our technique of clustering the different days, and here we clustered across 3 clusters, so the less active, the moderately active, and the very active kids. And the figure on the right side shows the average consistency of days in the most active cluster. So we can see there's as well quite a lot of variation and a trend to increase toward the end. But the dotted line showing the participants who were less active at the beginning actually show a little bit, it seems like they benefit a little bit more from the program. And you can see here in the middle of the program, we have a steep increase here. And this is something that is consistent across our data coming from the study in Australia and in New Caledonia, and we are investigating which modules here in the middle of the program were that effective. Using the clustering technique as well, so the technique I talked about a bit earlier, when we cluster the kids in days, taking into consideration both the sedentary time and moderate to vigorous physical activity. Here, using the gene active, so the research grade activity trackers that the kids were at the beginning and after the iEngage program, we measured physical activity across several days, and then we clustered the days. And we clustered the days, and then we clustered the participants into those different cluster of different sedentary time and physical activity. And so the less active is the number 1, and the more active is with less sedentary time is the number 6. And everything you can see here in green are the participants that have shifted after the program into a cluster that was either number 4, so already met the World Health Organization activity guidelines, or that transitioned into a more active cluster. So it's a technique as well that is able to identify, how the activity and how the sedentary time change, and help to understand as well at the individual, but as well at the cohort level, the impact of the intervention. So we can see the shift in terms of behavior when we compare the before versus after. So I've talked about, and this is the last thing I wanted to show you today, I've talked about clustering by days, but what we've done as well is clustering the hours during the day, because kids attend school, and at school they have, a lot of the time is not their own choice, I guess, in terms of being physically active or not. So we as well identified all the clusters taking the different hours of the day, and we wanted to see if, when we do the iEngage intervention, there is a change not only during the whole day, but if there is particular time during the day where the change is more obvious or significant. So this is what we did. And when we analyzed the hours, we identify 4 different clusters that would classify all of the different hours. And we found that it was after school, and most of the time after 4 p.m., that there was a shift in terms of kids getting into more physical activity and spending more time into those early cluster of higher physical activity. And if I wanted to show you something that maybe speaks a little bit more to that, here we have a graph in which we have on the left side the hours of the day, and we have separated sedentary time, MVPA, and light. And you have the 2 curves showing the physical activity pre and post. So if we have a look at the green in the middle, we can see, and the bright green are the data post-intervention, we can see that the kids take opportunities at different times during the day, but mostly during recess at school. And very importantly, after school, they found opportunities here to increase both the light activity and the vigorous activity and to do less sedentary time, which is, I think, very interesting because it shows that the kids, probably in connection with the parents, because via the booklets, they can connect with the family and the communities. They were empowered. It was not structured activity. They were actually empowered to find the time for more physical activity and particularly for more moderate, vigorous physical activity. So this is looking at the data this way, what we can learn. So what's next for us? Well, what we would like to do is actually to take a better advantage of the step data we collect during the program to provide automated feedback. So develop algorithms that would help us to identify which days or which hour the person has been more active, to identify that time and say, you know, something around, oh, this is amazing, you know, yesterday or the day before or the 2 previous days, you've been able to do more physical activity at 10 a.m. Maybe you can try to reproduce that. So it's really trying to get into that. And I guess in terms of the messaging, this is where we really would like as well to get into co-design with young people to understand what type of messaging would be the more effective for them. And the last thing is, I mean, obviously I've only talked about physical activity in this talk. In the iEngage program, we have a few modules about food. I mean, it's more about sugar in the food and soft drinks. But it's very difficult to, as you know, not think about food. Like, you know, we talk about energy expenditure, but what's, you know, the way in, the energy intake and the quality of the food. So we have developed for the Pacific region, digital 24-hour recall app in which we have a database with the food of the Pacific region. And it's very particular because in this region, the traditional food and the family farming and the whole food is still very present, but the processed food is kind of extremely present as well, and you can see on that picture. So really trying to understand, and we want to merge that information coming from the sensors, the iEngage platform, and the 24-hour digital recall to really understand the patterns. When do people eat, what they eat, how often, when do people do engage in physical activity and how often? Because we know that the different patterns and how food intake and the quality of intake combines with physical activity has impact as well on metabolic health. That's it from me, and I just wanted to, I guess, thank you for your attention and just mention that this work wouldn't be possible without partners, particularly industry partners. It's connected to the work we do in the Pacific, and it's been funded as well by different groups. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Corinne, for a fantastic talk. We've got time for some questions, and I'm going to focus on the ones that are quite specific to measurements, because I think there's possibly going to be the most useful. Hopefully we can get all of them done. So the first question is, thanks, Corinne, super interesting and useful. A couple of questions about accelerometry. If we're working in a setting where we use the same accelerometer in both adults and children, would the data algorithm analysis need to be tailored to each age group?
Yes, I would say yes. And particularly if our work would show that, but there's already different papers. And for example, with the gene active accelerometer, which is the one we've used, you can find in the literature cutoff values for children and adolescents, toddlers as well, I believe, but as well for adults and then older adults. And I guess when we go toward older age, the bout duration is not that important because people trend to engage and stay longer in a typical activity. But when we talk about kids, it's really burst of activity. So yeah, absolutely. The short answer is yes. You would need to use different threshold value at least. Yeah.
And just following on, what are the implications for sleep tracking with the same device? We use 30-second bouts for sleep, but if we collected the data as high resolution, that means the physical activity data could be used. I think you can see the question there.
Yes, I can see the question. Yeah, it's a very good question, because there are some studies in which we wanted to capture both sleep and physical activity, and I guess it's always a trade-off between what's possible. I know with sleep you need, there's some trackers that are better than others. Algorithms have already been developed. Like for the gene active, I'm not sure all of the algorithms have been fully developed for assessing sleep patterns in young people. So it's always a trade-off. If you have 30 seconds, depending on the age of the population, I guess you would have to look a little bit in the literature what people say about the 30 seconds, but you have lots of studies using the 30 minutes average, so I think you are still within collecting a very good data set. There's a few things you may not be able to capture, but it doesn't mean that you won't be able to capture some of the physical activity and the MVPA. And if you're using the same methods, before, after, or within your different groups, I guess you still have a good data set, yeah, and a good way to analyze and to have good outcomes. Yeah.
I'm going to try and fit in a couple more questions before we finish. The next one is from Ian, asking about, given reliance on accelerometer data to infer physical activity intensity, and he was wondering if you can comment on how research in this space can account for the likelihood of false positive records, e.g. young people waving their arms about to artificially increase recorded steps.
Yes, very good question. I mean, this is always the difficulty with wrist accelerometry, is how do you make the difference between agitation, false positive. So one way, for example, we did that looking at our data set, is that we wouldn't use the 1 second bout, because within that one there's quite a lot of false positive. So we had a look at the data set and we tried to identify what would be for our population the ideal bout to avoid losing too much of that moderate to vigorous physical activity without taking into account too many of the false positive. This is correct. It may be, or it may also relate to the question you are asking in your research. If you really want to identify the patterns when it happens, which time of the day, in a more precise way. And the thing with, young people, I would like to say, and I haven't said, is that amongst all of the interventions that have been done, the results are often very disappointing. So when you after several weeks or months increase MVPA by 5 minutes, you're happy. So the question is, is it really that disappointing, or is it because we are missing some of that information? I guess that's the question we would like, to ask. But definitely you want to avoid to having bouts of very short duration that would increase the false positive. There's always a bit of a trade-off.
I'm going to ask one last question, which is actually about which was ethics approval covered by the Australian ethics, or did your team have local ethics? And another one about a little bit about how communities were consulted.
So the first one is ethical community ethics.
So HREC cover both countries in Australia, and
we have two different ethics. I mean, two different ethics application, two different platform. One it was in French, one was in English. So it's the same platform, two different languages that went through the ethical frameworks in each country. And the way we engage with the community. So the work we've been doing in that community in Lifu spanned across several years, and really started with trying to understand the physical activity on site, trying to use surveys, realizing surveys didn't provide the right information because the questions actually didn't make sense for the kids. So trying to use the technology and understand how the technology could work. And we have engaged with the community a little bit on the go with that study because really, iEngage is a very innovative program, and it was very difficult to, try to explain before delivering. So we started with a framework, and the way we collaborated as well with the industry partner was that on the go we could add a few things as well. So just before delivering the program. But what we want to do in the future is absolutely to engage. Now that we know what we can do, how we can deliver, we've learned so much from those initial studies. We actually want to engage with the communities and with the children in a more structured way. Absolutely, this is for us something we look at.
Well, I think we've run out of time. Corinne, thank you for a fascinating talk. I'm sure you'd be happy to answer more questions if they came through on the email. And
absolutely, yes, yeah.
And thank you everyone for attending today. It's time to go back to work.
Thank you.